Hey, ladies, welcome back to the podcast. Very excited to talk about homesteading and real life and how we can do it. I have got Jocelyn here with me on the podcast today. So, Jocelyn, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me on the podcast today.
Yeah, so I got questions for you. Talking about homesteading, how do we do it in an easy way that we can actually accomplish?
Mm-hmm.
And how can it actually benefit our lives? So we're going to jump straight into it. So, Jocelyn, why don't you introduce yourself, your family, your blog, and what you guys do?
Yeah. So again, my name is Jocelyn. I'm a stay-at-home mom to two little girls, ages 1 and 3. And my husband and I live in North Dakota, and my husband farms commercially as well as we have our homestead. So our farm is actually an original homestead. So my
That's really
husband's
cool.
great great grandfather actually proved up our land in 1887, and our family has just been on that land ever since. So that's kind of some really cool heritage that I got to marry into. So in a way, I guess you could say that I married into homesteading. I was just kind of lucky in that aspect. But I've always had a desire to learn, I guess you could say, old fashioned skills. I have a background in family and consumer science, which in other states it might be known as home economics still. So I actually taught high school for several years, and I taught home economics or family and consumer science. So I did cooking and sewing and budgeting and all those great life skills. I actually didn't grow up with any of that. Most of that stuff I was learning for the first time in my college courses, but I became really passionate about it. And I just saw such a value to teaching that to students. And one of my absolute favorite things was teaching my students how to make things from scratch without a box, because it just blew their mind that you could make brownies and mac and cheese and all these things that no, you don't have to buy the box. You can make them from scratch and they're delicious. Um, so I had a huge passion for that. After having my girls, I decided to stay home full time. And, after being home with my girls for a while, it really sparked my desire to kind of be teaching again, because I still saw a value and a need for people to have these skills. And so that's kind of how and when I started my blog, and then later my podcast, which is dedicated to teaching women how to do some of those things for themselves. So cooking from scratch, but also other aspects like gardening and just being more self-sufficient in general, and kind of having those practical skills that I think we've really lost as a society over the years.
Mhm. Yeah, I love that. One of the first things I ever learned how to make from scratch years ago was really good cake. And I had so many people go, "Oh, you," in like real like big like multi-layer cakes, and people
Mhm.
would go, "Oh, you can make those from scratch? Like how do you do it?" Like they couldn't fathom that there really just could be flour and eggs and oil. Like there's like something magical in these boxes that like produce the cake. And I always think that's funny because I mean, before I started learning how to cook from scratch, I didn't know how you made anything. I didn't know you could make ranch dressing and, all this stuff. And so I love that kind of light bulb moment of you can make brownies and you can make mac and cheese. Like it's just it's so cool. And I have that passion too of teaching people. So I just think that's very fun. Okay, so let's dive in. Okay, so first of all, I think that's really, really cool that you're on this like multi-generational
Mhm.
homestead. I so wish that today we could still do that. Go get your 5 acres and like establish it. Like
Yeah.
so amazing. But let's talk about we talk about homesteading a lot, but what is homesteading? What does that look like practically for your family?
Yeah. So I think for us, it's a sense of slowing down and being more intentional. And honestly, that is a big part of it is when you commit to, growing, preparing, producing some of your own food. If you're going to do that, something else has to get crossed off your schedule.
Mm,
You can't be running around to all these different activities every night, every weekend, and then still expect yourself to be able to be in your kitchen making things from scratch, taking care of your garden, taking care of your animals. If you have animals, that's not going to happen if you've got, you're traveling a lot, that kind of thing. So I think homesteading is really slowing down, living simply, being motivated to prepare or grow some of your own food, and trying to just be frugal and resourceful with what you have.
Mm. Yeah, I really like that. I think too, we talk about homesteading from time to time here on this podcast, and I fully think of myself as like a partial homesteader with all the stuff we do within the kitchen and our small garden. And yet we live in the suburbs. And a lot of times people think, oh, to be a homesteader, like a homesteader is someone on 80 acres, who's been doing it forever and has, 100% lives off the land. But what I really love is all the degradations of what it can be to be a homesteader. Like you can live in the city and still have a small garden, work on preserving. Like there's so many skills that you can take. It doesn't have to be living on 80 acres. You can do it in everyday life. And that's what I get really excited about, that it can look so many different ways.
Yeah, I agree with what you said as far as like, we just have this picture that you're in this rural place. And like, I mean, I do live on a farm. We do live in the middle of nowhere and have all these acres, but that's because my husband is a commercial farmer. Like, I don't care. If I was living in a city, I would still have my garden in my backyard and do all the same things that I'm doing.
Yes.
And like you said, homesteading can be so many different things. I truly believe anybody can homestead if you really want to. Even if you're in an apartment,
Yep.
you can still do all the things from scratch. You can, if you have a patio or a balcony, set some plants out, have your window herbs. You can do so much even in really small spaces. And it really just comes back to what your mindset is more than, what you really have as far as land.
Yeah. So if someone is, I think especially since 2020, in the last 4 years, people have gotten really much more interested in becoming more self-sufficient, of realizing, oh, I could grow a couple tomato plants and can them for the year ahead. Like just realizing that, maybe our food system's not as stable as we've just assumed growing up in this culture. And so a lot more people are interested in this. So, what are your recommendations for someone starting out? Like, if you're like, I'm really interested in that, but this is such a huge topic, where do I begin?
Yeah. And I know when you first kind of dive down the rabbit hole of wanting to start homesteading, it can be really overwhelming because you just start getting excited about all the things. You're like, I want to make
Yes.
sourdough and have my garden and get backyard chickens. But if you haven't grown up with any of that and you don't know how to do any of that, it's a lot. It's really overwhelming. So I think there's kind of a natural progression that you can follow to set yourself up a little bit better. And I think the first place that everybody can start, no matter where you're at, is starting in your kitchen and teaching yourself how to cook from scratch, because cooking is really the backbone of a homestead. When you think about the other areas of homesteading, whether it's gardening, preserving animals, any of that, if you don't have the skills in the kitchen, those other areas aren't going to be as useful. You can grow a whole garden full of tomatoes and cucumbers, but your family's probably only going to eat so many of those fresh. So if you don't know how to cook them and make different meals with them, or you don't have the confidence to can your tomatoes or things like that, it's not going to be a big use to you. So really, starting small and getting comfortable in your kitchen, I think, is the first place that everybody needs to start. And I know you, Jami, talk about, the kitchen all the time on your show and give some really great practical advice. And probably your listeners already have a great jump start on those skills, if they want to dive into homesteading.
Yeah, I love that as a starting place, because there were a few years there where I was like, oh, gardening sounds cool, but it also feels like you're spending a lot of money to have cucumbers coming out of your ears for 2 weeks. Like, how actually helpful is that to my household when we're so busy? We have so many things going on. And then, a lot of gardeners, people at church will just kind of give away baskets of, oh, I have so many cucumbers. Do you want some? And I mean, I think that's lovely, but I felt like for the effort and time you're putting in to have produce for a couple of weeks a year, like woohoo. And then it was just this light bulb moment of, oh, well, you can make pickles. Oh, you can can the tomatoes. Like, oh, I see. Like it just clicked into place that with that, if you are preserving your garden, like duh, but I don't know why it just really hadn't clicked that if you're preserving your garden, that is when you have the major payoff. And so that's what I started learning was like, well, if I'm in a garden, I need to know how to can tomatoes. I don't know how to do that. And so those kitchen skills, I agree. become like that really great first starting place. Plus, if you don't have a garden, if you live in the city, there's often farms you can go to buy 20, 40 pounds of tomatoes. You can still do a lot of this without necessarily having everything on your own land. But I think even having a container or two of tomatoes, a little plot in your backyard can be so helpful. So one question I get asked a lot is, how does someone start growing some of their own food? If they're brand new to this, what's a good starting place for gardening?
Yeah, I would say with gardening, start small because it is easy to kind of get in over your head. You get all these packets of seeds and you go, okay, I'm just going to plant a few of everything. And then it's the middle of the summer and the weeds are coming up and then things start producing. And you're like, this is a lot and this is more than we can eat. And I don't know what to do with this all. And you just get overwhelmed. So when someone is just starting out with gardening, I really only recommend choosing like 4 to 6 key things that your family enjoys. Focus on that for the first year and don't plant it in like mass quantities. Just plant kind of like what you think your family's going to eat fresh. And then if you have any excess, that's a great time to start practicing some food preservation. If you have a little bit of extra green beans, oh, how can I freeze these? Or you have some extra tomatoes, okay, I'm going to try canning, but then you're not trying to can like 50 pints of tomatoes or, it's in manageable quantities. And then, once you get to the next year, if the first year you felt like, okay, I did my 4 things, I think it went pretty well. Try 1 to 2 more things. And then just gradually you can start to build up that garden in a manageable way versus trying to do it all that first year and just getting so overwhelmed and really maybe wasting some time if things didn't do as well because they weren't being watered, they weren't being weeded, they weren't really being tended to because it was just a lot.
Yes, I love that advice. That's what I love to do is just go incrementally, start slow, but you get all the seed packets in front of you, or you go to Home Depot or the nursery and you see all the plants and you just get too excited, like, I'm going to plant all of these. And then it can quickly become way too much. So, what are some of your favorite, like, if you had to pick like maybe 5 things to plant in your garden, what are some of your favorites?
Yeah. So I think choose things that your family eats most.
Mm.
So I think it can be easy to go, oh, well, this person recommends doing these plants for beginners. But like if your family, maybe it's green beans. Green beans are a pretty easy one to grow. Maybe you don't really eat that many green beans or your kids don't like green beans. That's not much of a point to growing a ton of green beans if you're just not going to eat it. And your kids are going to be more motivated to help too if it's something they enjoy. So I would say choose things that your family really likes. I guess for us personally, if I had to narrow it down to 5, it'd be hard because we have a big garden now, but also I have a lot of help. I actually have like my in-laws, we're all kind of in the same farmstead. So I get lots of help from my in-laws too. So we have a big
Oh, that's
garden.
fun.
But if I had to narrow it down, probably green beans, peas, tomatoes,
Mhm.
cucumbers, maybe squash, mostly because I have 2 little girls that could eat a pound of squash in one sitting, and it makes great baby food.
Yes. Yeah, I really like that. I like your tip too about finding things that your kids are excited about. That's something that we do every year is when we get our seeds out, I always let my kids pick a couple of things that they want to grow because I just, it's fun to involve them. But what I found is that they are so much more excited to get out in the garden and help. And at the beginning, when we're getting it all started and the seeds are going, like everybody's excited and is into it. Well, and me too. Then you get a few weeks into it, you're in the middle of summer and it's hot and like no one wants to go out and tend to it. Like, I don't want to, it's too hot. And the kids are like, I don't want to. But what I found is if I'm like, well, you need to go check on your carrots. And they're like, oh, yeah. So one of my kids loves rainbow carrots, like, the ones that are the different colors. So we plant a ton for him. And he is always like, I got to go check on those. Another kid loves tomatoes. So it's like, it is really fun, not only to have their kind of buy-in and get excited, but it does help when you're like, oh no, are our carrots doing okay? What do we need to do? They're just so much more excited to get out there and help. And so I love that tip of plant some things that they're really excited about because it just makes it more fun overall. So next thing is, I kind of touched on this. So I'll see if you have any other advice, but what if you don't have space for garden animals or you're renting? I mean, there's so many different situations we might find ourselves in that we think, oh, I want to get started on all this. But for whatever reason, I can't do the actual growing of plants or animals myself.
Yeah. I would say definitely use local farms to fill in the gaps. So, I mean, and see what you can do just on your own too, because maybe you are renting, maybe you're in an apartment and you can't necessarily go till up a garden in your backyard, or maybe you don't have a backyard, but trying to get creative with maybe some potted plants. If you have just a little bit of space that gets some really good sunlight or can be a little bit outdoors, you can grow a few things yourself. But yeah, using local farms, whether it's farmers market, whether you have connections to local farmers in your area or through your church that you know people who garden, asking them like, hey, would I be able to plant, just a little section out of your garden? Or just getting kind of creative with maybe some alternative ways if you don't have the space yourself.
Yeah, I like that. I like starting to form more relationships with farmers and just other people doing things too, which at first felt really overwhelming because I'm like, I don't have any connections. I don't know anybody. But now that we've been here in Oklahoma now for 2 years and really starting to kind of like dig in, and we have friends who have similar passions of really starting to want to do more stuff. So we have one friend who has like 70 chickens now. He just has this great spot for chickens. It's too many eggs for him. And so he started trading with other people. So we have another friend who makes like really amazing homemade granola. So she'll make a huge batch of granola once a week for their family and they'll trade eggs. We have another friend who does she'll bake 2 loaves of sourdough each week and trade for eggs. So like there's things you can do too, because sometimes, I want to buy all pasture raised eggs from a local farm, but we just can't afford it for our family. There's, and I totally understand why they're charging that amount, but there's certain times that can be like, oh, I can't, quite make it. And so there's really neat opportunities when you start looking for them for produce, for, trading meat, for, there's so many things that you can come up with and they take time to establish, but we have really found a lot of benefit to that, that you're not necessarily having to buy everything, but kind of buying things, but also kind of barter system has worked out really well.
Yeah, and I agree. It does take time to build those connections. And especially if you're in a new community,
Yes.
a lot of times, like local farms, it's not like they're advertising, they're not going to put on a billboard or, these big ads. Oh, yep, I'm selling farm fresh eggs. Come buy them. So it's like almost like a word of mouth type thing.
Yes.
So it does take time. And sometimes you just kind of have to be brave and start asking around. And again, I think your church community is a great place to do that, to start looking for some of those connections. And it's a lot easier to find people that are willing to be open and share, or, not even just share like physical food or space or things like that, but share wisdom and tips and come alongside you in your homesteading journey.
Yeah. And I think too, when we first started going to our new church here, there was one or two people who kind of lived farther out on farms, but mostly it wasn't. Most of us live in the suburbs. So at first I kind of felt like, oh, there's not a lot of people doing this, but I started talking to people and they're like, oh, we want to buy land. Oh, we really want to do that. We want to get chickens. Like, and then you start realizing there is more of a network of maybe even people who are all beginning, but like you said, you can share so much research. You can share, we have friends now. My one friend, her and her in-laws do a really large garden every year because they've got this space. So last year they grew all these peppers. They just had so many peppers. So my friend asked me, hey, can I borrow your dehydrator? Because I need to figure out what to do with all these. So when she came to pick up the dehydrator, she brought these 2 like massive things of peppers for me. And it was so great because she didn't have the resources to invest in a large dehydrator. I had one. We were able to do that. And a year before, we both just lived in the suburbs. It didn't seem, you wouldn't have necessarily thought we were interested in starting to cultivate these different skills. She borrowed a book from me on dehydrating. Like, it's just really neat when you start forming those connections. And it doesn't have to be this big, huge thing. They don't have a farm. We don't have a farm. But starting to have those small connections can make a really big difference.
Yeah. And I think for a lot of people, especially when you're just starting out, homesteading can kind of be a closet hobby, like unless when you don't have land and chickens and you're not doing all the things, it's like the average person probably isn't going to know that you're necessarily into that. I mean, I think there's
Yes.
a lot of people, even that, are in our community that they have no idea that I make my own bread and, do all those things. But if someone asked me about it, I would be more than willing to talk their ear off of,
Yeah.
baking bread and gardening and all those things. So sometimes you just have to be brave and be the first one to bring it up.
Yes, I love that. I love the beginning stages of that too, which is so cool. All right, so why don't you share with us your where your blog is and all the stuff you have kind of going on online?
Yeah, so our website is farmfedfamily.com. So we have free recipes on there, gardening tips, some other good homesteading resources. We have a few freebies that we can share with you. You can get signed up for our newsletter. And then my other resource is my podcast, which is the Farm Family Table.
Mm.
So I do weekly content and it's all geared towards beginner homesteading. I think sometimes there can be a big gap between the people you see on Instagram that are already knee deep and have the 50 acres and all the animals and things. And the person who's just starting out and is like, I actually have no idea how to do any of that, let alone like put a seed in the ground and watch it grow.
Yeah.
So start at the very beginning in the podcast and kind of help build from the ground up. It gives a lot of practical application, but also encouragement, because that's another area that I really see lacking is especially online and social media. It's so easy to just get overwhelmed or even just compare and think I can't do that. I'm never going to be at that level. I'm never going to
Yeah.
achieve that. So just the encouragement to come alongside you that yes, you can, and we're going to do it in baby steps, and this is how we're going to do it, and really tying Christ into it too and having him as our anchor through the whole journey.
Yeah, that's really important. I love that. Well, we will put the links down below for people to go check that out. And I encourage everybody to go listen to the podcast. I have just subscribed today, so I'm excited to dive in and start listening as well. So, Jocelyn, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing with us.
Thank you so much for having me.